Let's talk about the books that I have finished and DNF'd and put down for now recently within the last few months, like September, October. This is the second to last wrap up I'll probably have because I'm sure I'll do one more end of the year wrap up and then that'll be it. That's how fast the end of the year is coming. Before I get into the books that I read, I want to touch on the two books that I DNF'd / put down for now, but I think they might both end up being DNFs, I think. The first for sure DNF is The Atlas Complex by Olivia Blake. This is the third and final book in the Atlas 6 series. And I started reading this and just found that I didn't care. I liked the Atlas 6 enough. I read the second book, which I'm not remembering what it was, Atlas Paradox, shortly after, within the year that it came out. And it was like fine. And then I noticed when I started trying to read this that I just like did not care at all about these characters and what was happening. And like I had read a synopsis to catch up and I was like, this is just overly bloated. And I just don't care. So I decided to DNF this and DNF this series, which is interesting because as I'm filming this, I am currently reading an Olivia Blake book, but it's a standalone. And I'm doing better with that because I think that she does need editing that she doesn't get, but it's working better for the book I'm currently reading. So you hear about that at the end of the year. The other book that I was really waffling on if I wanted to DNF it or just set it down for now, and I think I might still just like keep it around, I don't really know. It's The Forest Where the Phoenix Sleeps by Brooke Marley Jones. This is an indie published or self-published, I think, book. And it just needs editing the way that so many books need editing. I got about halfway through, right? This is a story that takes place modern day. It's this woman who works at a coffee shop and something happens where she figures out that she does actually have magic, like a crime occurs because of this. And there are people in the world, it's kind of very similar to like mutants in like the X-Men kind of series where people are calling people that have magic slurs and things and whatever. And she figures out she's one of these people, but then she gets whisked away to like a different sort of like Fey dimension kind of by this guy. And everything kind of goes from there. So this is just overly long. It is kind of romantasy adjacent. I think the author was trying to combine some like cozy stuff with some romantasy stuff, whatever. There's suspicions that I have, I'm pretty sure I'm right, that like actually they're mates in some way, maybe reincarnated. I don't know. I wanted to get to that part because that was kind of interesting. But there's just so many inconsistencies, like the world, the forest where he takes her is super, super dangerous, but they just keep avoiding being killed by these things that are supposed to be like the worst of the worst in the woods. And then there's this thing where she's like, you need to teach me magic. And he's like, no. And then she just like learns some of the hardest magic ever by just being told like, just do this. And then she just does it. And I'm like, no. So yeah, I just started getting to the point where I was like, I don't want to read this anymore. I got, 225 pages in. It was a lot of repetition. It was just like a bloated page count. And the writing is just like, So I think for a shorter book, maybe I would still give it a go. But I don't think I can actually continue with this. I was tempted because the beginning was like pretty decent for, like I could let some things go. I couldn't let things go anymore, and it just started getting to a place where it wasn't that good, which is a bummer because I love a sentient woods. This definitely has that, but the rest of it's not great. So now on to the books that I've actually finished. First is Children of Time by Adrian Tchaikovsky. This is the first book, and I think it's just the Children of Time series. I don't actually know what the series name for this is, but if you've heard about it, this is the giant alien spiders book, which doesn't actually encompass what this is. So this is the first in a really large space opera where this is already in our far future. So the far future of Earth. Earth has become very built up at the very beginning of the story, and they are sending out teams of scientists to terraform. We learn in the very first chapter that one of these terraforming things went horribly wrong because there was like a mutiny on Earth that was sort of like anti-science, anti-doing this, whatever. So because they were going to terraform and then put monkeys down there and have them evolve using this like mutated virus thing, gene virus thing, in order to, by the time they got there would be like a civilization of humans kind of like waiting for them or whatever, because they would have sped up evolution. That goes wrong in the very first chapter, and Earth has a mutiny. And so then thousands of years after that, you start following people who are now on a generation ship, so many years later, trying to discover this world that they thought maybe was a world that they could go to after all of these things happened on Earth. And it's a generation ship where mostly they've been just like sleeping. And they get there and they discover the things are not exactly like they can't even land for reasons. I'm not even gonna get into it. And you also concurrently get the what's happening generationally on the planet, because the monkeys don't survive. it gets to spiders, and spiders do. So spiders start evolving in the way that the monkeys were meant to evolve, but it's different because they're spiders. And yeah, so you get to see like generations, again, thousands of years there and what's happening. And then you also get later this like human civilization, but also thousands of years in this generationship. I know it's kind of confusing. This is basically one giant setup for what I believe will be the rest of the series. That'll be much more contained. This is just like, what are all of the wacky events over thousands of years that have happened to get us to where we are? Because that'll all be important. So yeah, so this is more than just giant alien spiders. It's fascinating though. The undertaking of this was like very cool. I gave this a 4.25 because it is sort of set-up-y in a lot of ways, but the undertaking of it and like the world building and everything, fascinating. It's less character focused though, because I mean, you are following some of the same humans on that generation ship, but you're following different generations of spiders and stuff. So it's much more about plot than it is about characters. But I'm interested now, once we have this like foundation of what happened in this civilization's like past, what the future of the books will be. So I will continue to read these, and I'm very intrigued. Then I read one of my favorite books of all time that I continue to talk about and will continue to talk about forever, and that is Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmerer. If you've never heard of this book, I'm sure you have. This is a nonfiction written by an indigenous woman. She's from the Potawatomi tribe, and she's also a botanist. So she is talking about plants that are indigenous to the United States and weaving in indigenous knowledge of plants and indigenous like ways of looking at the world, as well as lessons we can learn from plants, and is mostly using plants that are very like holy and sacred to different indigenous tribes, not even just the Potawatomi. Like she talks about a number of different places. And I've tabbed this up so much. I've used a lot of the quotes in here for my digital gardening, which if you're not familiar with that, I will leave a link on the screen talking about me doing that. This is so interesting when you're thinking about late stage capitalism and wanting to tear a lot of that down, and that the way that we treat the world and nature has ramifications into kind of like everything. There's so many, I can't completely talk about it in one little snippet like this. And people have talked about this book everywhere, so nothing I say is going to be new. She's outstanding. I listened to the audiobook as well. I concurrently read the physical and the audiobook, and her voice is so soothing and wonderful, and I just love her. So I plan on reading her other books as well. She has another book, Gathering Moss, that came out, I think, before this one, possibly, and then a newer one called The Serviceberry that recently came out in the last like year or so. So I plan on reading all of those. If you haven't read this, even if you don't think that would be up your alley, I think everyone should read this. It should be required reading. Everyone should read it. It's outstanding. 5 out of 5 stars. I quote it literally all the time now. Then we have The Lotus Empire by Tasha Suri. This is the third and final book in the Burning Kingdom series, which is an epic fantasy that is following primarily 2 female characters whose lives are thrown together because of political machinations and things. One is from a like colonizing nation and the other is from an indigenous nation, but they are also, there's like more to it than that, and it's very multi-layered as far as like the ways in which the one people were conquered and their gods and how bad kind of their gods were and all this stuff. So there's a lot of talk of like various religions and fate and whatever, and it's sapphic. So these 2 women are in love, and it's like, I wouldn't call it toxic, but it's fraught because of everything going on. So it's very cool. There's a lot of like nature magic, but then again, talks of other religions and things. And so this is the culmination of that. So I can't obviously go into a ton of it, but this was fantastic. I had just reread the first 2 books in the series recently on audio, and then continued on and finished this one before the end of the year, which is what I wanted to do. And this was just a very satisfying conclusion for what happened. I have a lot of complaints sometimes about how some series just don't stick the landing. And I think this one did. Like thematically, everything was tied up and made sense, even if some of the things were sad, based on what this whole series was about. So I think this was done super well. It's also a series that I think would be really, really good on reread. I mean, the first 2 books were great, but I think just like this series in general is just so good. Tasha Suri is so good. So yeah, this was 5 out of 5 stars for sure. Then I read Honoring Your Ancestors by Mallory Vaudois, I think is her name. And this is a witchcraft book. So I'll talk about this more in the Bibliothecary, which is linked down below. If you want to check out all of my like more witchcraft intensive posts are there. But I really enjoyed this. This was part of my personal curriculum for fall. And this was a pretty good book for that. She does have more of a, and she says this from the beginning, that she has like a folk Catholicism leaning, and so there's some things in here that are much more like based in folk Catholicism, but she also says like there's ways that you can tweak this not for Catholicism. That's just her upbringing. She's Italian. She does like folk Italian magic and things like that. But there's also some interesting things that I think I wouldn't have encountered in other books about ancestor veneration, and I'm reading more. I'm continuing to read more on ancestor veneration, so I have a lot of little like tabs and stuff. I use some of these things when I did my Samhain ritual this year, and yeah, I really enjoyed this. 4 out of 5 stars. Another nonfiction book I read, Conflict is Not Abuse by Sarah Schulman. This I read mostly on audio. I now have a physical copy just for a few quotes and things because this book is interesting. I gave this like 3.5 out of 5 stars because I think the first part was really good. This is basically what it says on the tin, is that it is talking about how much we mess up, especially in Western culture for a variety of reasons, conflict versus abuse. So we generally will say that like almost everything is abusive, mostly because people basically don't validate your emotions of like harm unless it's targeted at somebody, but sometimes harm happens and it's not, no one's actually done anything wrong. But conflict is more likely to happen. And like abuse is when there's power dynamics that are different. Conflict is just two people on the same playing field having conflict with each other, you know? So that's like the very high level thesis of this kind of. She does really well with this, I would say, when she's talking more about like interpersonal, smaller scale conflict, like between normal people. She eventually goes more into political conflict, and like she ends up actually, this was written, I don't remember exactly, like before like 2023. So I think it was written honestly closer to like 2016, and talks about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And I think, and she was talking about again how like sometimes the people who are actually abusers claim that they're abused, and there's like a bunch of different things. But I think when she goes into more like geopolitical conflict things, it gets a little too confusing. Not even confusing. Like I think she just loses the plot a little bit. I'm not exactly sure what her plot entirely was. And I also think sometimes she boils it down to be a little bit too simple. Like one of her things about personal conflict is just like, get on the phone with each other. And like, you know, be able to like listen and whatever. And it's like, yes, and there's more complication than that. But I think that there's some really good points in here about how, you know, something I talk about a lot with people is that everyone has a narcissistic ex. No, you don't. You just had a lot of people. You know, if you did, then I'm not talking to you. But a lot of people just had an ex that they were in conflict with who they weren't compatible with. The person didn't abuse you, though, even if you felt like harm, even if you felt bad. That does not necessarily equal abuse. So this is something that comes up a lot in different spaces. And so, yeah, there were some points in here that I think were really great, and then some points in here that kind of lost the plot. And she herself is not like a sociologist or anything. I think she's originally just like a novelist. Like this is a lot of her like, you know, just personal experience stuff. So when she gets into bigger topics, I think she kind of loses it a little bit. But overall, I still liked this enough to be like, you're interested in that like grand thesis, maybe check it out from the library or check out the audiobook or something. Because I think there is some good tidbits in here. I then read Dopamine Nation by Anna Lemke. This was like a 3-star book for me. This is a nonfiction book that essentially is talking about like dopamine and our attention spans and how like everything is made to grab our attention and for us to basically avoid hard feelings. So that interesting, but what I'm finding with a lot of these pop psychology books, which is what this is that it boils it down too much to the general public, where I'm like, me as someone with a master's degree and who's, you know, a licensed professional is like, yeah, I know, can you give me a little bit more? But I don't want to go into full academic text. So I'm trying to find this like middle ground between some of these like totally pop psych general public kind of books, which are great for people who like don't know anything about this, versus full academic literature, which I don't want either, because then it feels like I'm in a class that's very dry. So I'm trying to find something. But basically, I've been trying to find more books about, again, our attention spans, dopamine, you know, how our modern society is set up for dopamine hits all the time, whatever. I would say the first little bit of this book talks about that a little bit more, and just basically kind of repeats a lot of you know, what we already kind of know, but has more examples of just, you know, we as a Western society are very trained to avoid any negative feelings, to the point that like overuse of substances, of medications, of distractions, of addictions, whatever. Her big focus is mostly addictive personalities and like addicts, gambling addicts, sex addicts, whatever, which I think is good to like distill and explain a situation, but is not very nuanced. And there's even some points sometimes where she's like, people don't need their psychiatric meds. I mean, she makes a point to be like, this might not be for you, but consider that maybe you don't need Adderall. And I'm just like, this isn't really nuanced enough. Like she does put in like that she's not saying that it's a black and white issue, but then the writing about it is very black and white. And I'm like, huh. So this was like, again, fine. There were some points that I was like, okay, like again, I like this, you know, this thesis of what we're talking about, this like dopamine hits and whatever, and how I'm specifically trying really hard to get away from dopamine hit stuff with like modern media, but I needed something more. So I'm still on a hunt for that. If you have any books that you feel like fit that a little bit better, let me know. I need something in between those two realms. Then I read Psychopomp and Circumstance by Eden Royce. This is a little novella that is classified kind of as a horror novella, but I don't find it very horror. It's much more Gothic and like a Gothic family mystery. This follows the main character of Fee, who is a black woman in a Reconstructionist New Charleston. So it's a like fantasy version of like what the South might have looked like with some of this like magic and stuff, and like more like free black families. And she's from like an upper class black family, and her family is estranged from her aunt, her mom's sister, for reasons kind of unknown to her. And she was like an aunt that she really loved, but then she hadn't been in contact with, and that aunt dies mysteriously. And so she volunteers, much to her mother's dismay, to be the pomp for her aunt. So that basically is doing all of the funeral proceedings. And there's a lot of like magical things attached to that too. This is much more like kind of magical realism-y, fabulism kind of. And so she has to go to her aunt's house, who she hasn't seen in years, and learns more about her and learns more about like the family history and what created all this family trauma, and kind of like putting her aunt to rest. So yeah, this was really good, especially for a novella. I really enjoyed this. I like stories about like death and dying and grief and passing into the afterlife and things like that. And the way this combined some like historical things and cultural things with those magical elements was really cool. So I gave this 4 out of 5 stars. And then I read The Exiled Fleet by J.S. Dews. This is the second book in the, I don't actually know again, the Divide series. The first book, The Divide, was much more like space opera-y. It felt almost Mass Effect adjacent, even though it didn't have any aliens. It was all like humans and stuff. But it follows a group of people who are living on the Divide, which is basically where the universe is kind of like collapsing in on itself. And they are trained to like watch for these aliens that they had a war with a long time ago, to make sure like they don't come through the Divide and get to everybody else in the rest of like the galaxy and whatever. And in the first book, you discover that there's like much more political machination-y stuff going on with that. And the second book is them sort of like all the people that were part of that sort of Sentinel group deciding like, do we want to mutiny? What's going on? They have to have access to like more resources and stuff. How do we get those? Whatever. I am really torn about finishing this series. The final book, I just wasn't super engaged with this, but I listened to it mostly on audio. And the first book I read physically. And so I'm wondering, do I return back to physical copies of this? Is it just not like, is the audio just not hitting for me? I don't know. There was some different like cool reveals in this one that I was like, I should care more. So I don't know. If I finish it, I'm going to finish it before the end of the year, which is kind of my plan as of right now. But if I start reading the third one and don't care, I'm going to DNF it. But yeah, this was fine. This was like a solid 3 stars. But I think maybe I'm the problem here. I don't know. So yeah, as far as sci-fi though, like very enjoyable in some ways. But yeah, I don't know. I just wasn't connecting to it that much. But also I felt like I was kind of slumpy at the time. So who knows? And finally, we have An Education in Malice by S.T. Gibson. This is a standalone adult sort of Carmilla, the vampire Carmilla, retelling-ish. This is taking place in a dark academia setting and following 2 women, Carmilla and Laura, who are part of this prestigious girls' school, girls' university, and they are both taking this poetry seminar from this very mysterious professor, female professor, who obviously has a very inappropriate relationship with her students. And you kind of go from there where they are academic rivals to maybe lovers, and they're very, very obsessed with each other, and they're also obsessed with this woman. And yeah, it's the dark academia of it all, right? I would say the dark academia part is more of a background thing. Like sometimes we pull back in, like, remember they're at school, but it's more of like, I would say generally like a lesbian vampire story. If you wanted good toxic lesbian vampires out of Barrier Bones and Midnight Soil by V.E. Schwab and you were disappointed like I was, I think this hits that mark much better. Toxic without being like fully abusive, I would say, as far as between like Carmilla and Laura and stuff. There's some like BDSM elements in here, like light BDSM elements, and again, there's some stuff with teachers being like inappropriate with students and whatever. But if you're wanting some of that like toxic sapphic vampire stuff, this is much more that. And I had a good time with this. I gave this 4 out of 5 stars. So yeah, that is it for all of the books that I read the last couple of months. Comment below, let me know how your reading has gone and if you've read any of these books. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see all of you guys soon. Bye.